The quiet ones, the doubters, they're always the first to hear the knock from the other side.
The endless echo. My name is Emily Dawson, and I live in a small town called Harrows Creek in the middle of Missouri. There's nothing particularly special about this place, just a quiet town where the biggest excitement is the annual Harvest Festival and the occasional storm that knocks out power for a few hours. I've lived here my entire life, and most of the time, it's exactly what you'd expect from a sleepy rural town. The streets are lined with old oak trees, and the houses have that familiar charm with front porches where neighbors wave to one another. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are hard to keep. I'm a nurse at the local clinic, where I work long shifts and then spend my free time helping my parents with their small farm just outside of town. Life, for the most part, was simple. I would wake up early, have coffee with my mom, and spend my evenings reading or watching old movies on the couch with my dad. It was ordinary, but I liked it that way. There was a comfort in the mundane. But things started to shift after I moved into the old house on Ashwood Lane. It was an impulsive decision. I'd been looking for a place to escape to after breaking up with my fiancé, Ryan. The breakup was messy, and I was tired of feeling trapped in the same routines. I needed a fresh start, a change of scenery. So, when I found that old two-story house for sale, tucked away at the edge of town, I made an offer on it without much thought. The house had a certain charm to it, though it was far from perfect. It had been abandoned for a few years, and the previous owners had moved out suddenly, some story about moving closer to family. The place had stood empty for months, the windows boarded up and the lawn overgrown. Still, something about it called to me, and I figured it would be the perfect way to begin the next chapter of my life. When I first moved in, everything felt fine. The creaky floors were annoying, and the paint on the walls was peeling in spots, but I didn't mind. It was mine, and I could make it into something beautiful. There was a certain satisfaction in the hard work of cleaning and decorating a new place. But as the days went on, I began to notice small things, things that didn't quite add up. At first, it was just the silence. There were no birds chirping in the yard like there had been at my parents' farm. The air felt thick, almost stifling, especially at night. I would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I would hear the faintest sound, a creak on the stairs, a soft shuffle, like someone was walking around the house. I told myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, and old houses make strange noises. But then there were the dreams. They started a few nights after I moved in. At first, they were simple, just fragments of images, like memories I couldn't fully grasp. I'd dream of walking down a long, dark hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty house. Then, I'd reach a door, but it was always locked. I would stand there, listening to a faint scratching sound coming from the other side. Every time I tried to open the door, I would wake up, heart racing, covered in sweat. I tried to shake it off. It was just a dream. But the dreams didn't stop. They grew more vivid, more disturbing. I would walk the hallway again, but this time, the door would open. And behind it, I would see nothing. Just a dark, endless void. I would step forward, my hand reaching into the blackness, and then I'd wake up again. I didn't tell anyone about the dreams, not even my best friend, Lisa. She would have just brushed them off as stress, but I couldn't ignore them. Something was wrong, something was pulling me deeper into that house. The scratching behind the door grew louder in the dreams, and sometimes, I could hear it while I was awake. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. It was a crisp autumn evening, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The wind rustled the leaves, and I could smell the scent of damp earth. It should have been peaceful, but something about the air felt wrong. I wandered to the back of the house, where there was an old shed. It had been there when I moved in, half collapsed and covered in ivy. I had planned to get rid of it eventually, but something made me approach it now. As I neared the door, I noticed something odd: scratches, deep gouges, carved into the wood. They looked fresh. Too fresh. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the marks. My heart beat faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I turned the rusty knob. The door creaked open slowly, and a cold gust of air hit me, carrying with it the smell of decay. Inside the shed, there was nothing but shadows. I stepped in, my breath shallow, my eyes darting around. And then I saw it, something small, something odd lying on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and my stomach dropped when I realized it was a key. A key. But I didn't recognize it. I had no idea what it opened, but I had the unsettling feeling that it was connected to the door in my dreams. I held it in my hand, the metal cold against my skin, and felt an overwhelming urge to return to the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in my bed, the key burning a hole in my pocket. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, just another weird thing in a strange house. But the dreams wouldn't let me forget. They kept coming, more intense now. And then, I heard it, the scratching again. But this time, it wasn't in my dream. It was real. The sound came from somewhere in the house, a slow, deliberate scratching. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It was coming from the hallway, from behind the door I had seen in my dreams. I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was on the other side of that door, whatever was calling to me, I had to face it. The Endless Echo, Chapter 2, The Growing Dread. I spent the entire night staring at the door, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. The scratching had stopped shortly after I heard it, but I didn't dare move. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. What was on the other side of that door? Was it just my imagination running wild, or was something real, something sinister, lurking in the shadows of my home? The next morning, I tried to shake off the fear. It was just a noise. Houses make noises, especially old ones. I knew that. But the way that scratching had echoed through the walls, the way it had sent a chill down my spine, it didn't feel like something that could be explained away. I went to work at the clinic, hoping that the distraction would help me clear my head. The steady rhythm of checking patients and filling prescriptions was a welcome break from the swirling thoughts in my mind. But even there, I couldn't escape it. Every time I passed a hallway or stood by a window, I felt the weight of the house's presence pressing in on me, like an unseen force, always watching. As I was leaving work that afternoon, I ran into Linda, an older nurse who worked with me. She had been at the clinic longer than I had, and we often chatted during our lunch breaks. She had that calming presence about her, the kind of person who was always ready with a warm smile and a kind word. But today, her smile was faint, as though something was bothering her. "Hey, Emily, you look like you've seen a ghost," Linda said, raising an eyebrow. I forced a chuckle, hoping to brush it off. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." Linda studied me for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You're staying in that old house on Ashwood Lane, right?" I nodded, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. "You know, some folks around here say that house is haunted," she continued, her voice lowering to a whisper, as if someone might be listening. "Strange things have happened there over the years. People say they hear voices in the middle of the night, strange footsteps in the hallways. They say the last family that lived there, well, they just up and disappeared. Never heard from them again. Just a warning, hon, you might want to think twice about staying there." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I laughed again, but it came out more nervous than reassuring. "That's just local gossip, Linda. People like to make up stories around here." But Linda's face didn't change. "Maybe. But I thought you should know. I'm just looking out for you." Her words stuck with me long after I left the clinic. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just an old story, a rumor passed down through generations. But I knew, deep down, that there was something more to the house. I had felt it since the moment I moved in. That night, I returned home and found myself standing in front of the door to the hallway again. The key was still in my pocket, pressing against my side, reminding me of its mysterious origin. I didn't want to face it, but something pulled me toward it. I had to know what was behind that door. I took a deep breath and grabbed the key. It felt heavier now, like a weight on my chest, but I didn't hesitate. I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I placed the key in the lock. The metal felt cold under my fingers, and I could hear the sound of my heartbeat thumping in my ears. With a click, the door opened. The hallway beyond was dark, but the air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. My footsteps were muffled on the old carpet as I stepped inside, the silence swallowing me whole. I turned on the light, but it flickered once before staying on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I moved forward, my breath shallow, each step echoing through the empty space. I reached the end of the hall, the door at the far end staring back at me. It was the same as in my dreams, old, weathered, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. My fingers brushed over it, and I could feel the coldness radiating from it. Before I could turn the handle, a voice came from behind me, making me freeze in place. "Emily?" I spun around, my heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was my next-door neighbor, Claire. I hadn't seen her much since I moved in. She was a quiet woman, in her late 20s, with short brown hair and a reserved smile. She looked at me with concern, her arms folded across her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, taking a step closer. "I didn't mean to startle you. I just saw you walking around the yard earlier and wanted to make sure you were okay." I forced a smile, though I felt a rush of unease. "I'm fine. Just trying to get used to the house." Claire glanced past me at the hallway, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Is everything okay in here? I've been hearing some strange noises from your place." It's not like the house is haunted or anything, right? I felt my stomach drop. What kind of noises? She shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. It's like whispers, almost. Like someone's walking around when no one's there. My mind flashed back to the scratching sound I had heard the night before, and I suddenly felt very exposed, like Claire could see straight through me. I tried to laugh it off. Oh, I think it's just the house settling. You know how old houses can be. Claire didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask, she said before retreating back into her house. I stood in the hallway for a long time after she left, the door in front of me still waiting. My hand was cold against the brass handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Claire's words echoed in my mind, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood over me. She had heard the same things I had, the whispers, the footsteps. Was I just imagining it? Was it all in my head? I stepped back, away from the door, and turned the light off. I couldn't face it tonight. The tension in the air felt suffocating, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a choice. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my thoughts kept returning to the hallway, to the door, to the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that something was waiting for me to open that door. I finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The darkness felt oppressive, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I swore I heard a faint sound, like someone whispering my name. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more urgent. Emily. I jerked upright, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing. Just the silence of the house, the empty room. I tried to calm myself. It was just the wind. It had to be. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me into my dreams. The Endless Echo, Chapter 3, The Climax of Terror. The following days blurred together. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on me, something relentless, something dark. It was as if the house had become a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsing with a sense of malevolent intent. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant presence. I no longer needed to hear them in my dreams, they followed me everywhere I went. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of stress and exhaustion. But there was no denying it anymore. The whispers weren't just sounds, they were voices, familiar ones. Sometimes they would say my name, other times they would speak in hushed tones, as though discussing something I wasn't supposed to hear. The sound of footsteps echoed in the halls even when I knew I was alone. And every night, the scratching returned, this time louder, more frantic, coming from behind the door at the end of the hallway. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was behind that door. I knew I wasn't the only one who had heard it. Claire's strange words still lingered in my mind. She had heard the whispers too. But I couldn't talk to anyone else about it. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. And as the days went on, the feeling that I was being watched, trapped in the house, grew stronger. Then, things started to happen that I couldn't explain. It started with my parents. I had planned to visit them one Sunday afternoon, a habit I'd kept for years. I hadn't seen them much lately, too absorbed in the house and my work. But when I arrived at their farmhouse, I immediately knew something was wrong. The door was ajar, the living room lights flickering like a candle caught in a breeze. My stomach dropped as I stepped inside, calling out for them. "Mom? Dad?" There was no answer. The house felt off. The air was thick, heavy, and a strange, suffocating silence filled the space. I moved through the house, checking each room, but my parents were nowhere to be found. My heart began to race. Had something happened to them? I ran outside, checking the yard, but there was no sign of either of them. That was when I saw it, a trail of deep, scratch-like marks across the ground, leading away from the house. I followed the trail, the sense of dread in my chest growing with every step. It led to the old barn at the edge of the property. I could barely breathe as I approached the door, my hands shaking, but I had no choice. I had to know what had happened. When I opened the door, the stench hit me first, rotting wood, mold, and something worse, something foul. I couldn't see anything at first, the darkness in the barn swallowing up all light. But then, as I stepped inside, I saw it. My parents were standing there, motionless. They were just standing there, staring ahead, their eyes wide and unblinking, their faces expressionless. "Mom? Dad?" I shouted, but they didn't respond. I rushed toward them, my heart pounding in my chest, and I shook them, trying to get their attention. But they didn't react. Then I saw the scratches. The deep gouges that marred their arms, their faces, the marks that mirrored those I had found on the shed door. They were covered in them, fresh, bleeding, as if they had been clawed at, dragged somewhere. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I heard the whisper again, clear and unmistakable this time. "Emily." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice came from behind me, low and raspy, like it was coming from the depths of the earth. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I turned back to my parents, my heart racing. I had to get them out of here. I grabbed my mom's arm, trying to pull her away, but it was like she was frozen, her body stiff and unresponsive. And then the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I screamed, but the barn was silent again. The light flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. I felt a cold hand grip my heart, and my instinct screamed at me to run. I yanked the door open with all my strength and fled. I didn't look back. I raced back to the house, my mind spiraling out of control. What had happened to my parents? What were those marks? And what was the thing that had whispered my name? I was trembling by the time I got back to the house, my thoughts a frantic mess. I couldn't think straight. I needed answers. I needed to get to the bottom of this before it was too late. I decided to go back to the house on Ashwood Lane, the one place where all of this seemed to start. I couldn't wait anymore. I had to face whatever was in that house. When I arrived, the house seemed darker than before, like it was waiting for me. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my courage, before I walked up to the door and entered. The silence was suffocating, more oppressive than ever. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I knew what I had to do. I had to face the door at the end of the hallway. I had to open it and see what was behind it, no matter the cost. I grabbed the key from my pocket, and my fingers brushed over the cold metal. The house felt like it was closing in on me as I turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open with a groan that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the shape of something standing in the center of the room. I moved forward, my pulse pounding in my ears, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move in response to my every step. Then I saw it, the thing that had been whispering my name, the thing that had been scratching at the walls, the thing that had been haunting my dreams. It was standing there, its form a twisted, grotesque version of a person. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide. The creature's skin was peeling away, revealing jagged, blackened veins running beneath it. It was the thing that had been haunting me all along, the thing that had been waiting for me to open the door. Before I could react, the creature lunged at me, its cold fingers wrapping around my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was too strong, its grip like iron. In that moment, I realized the truth: I was never going to escape this house. The thing that had been tormenting me was real, and it had been waiting for me all along. And now, it was time for me to face my ultimate nightmare. Chapter 4: Confrontation with Horror ****. The creature's grip tightened around my neck, and I struggled to breathe. Its face hovered inches from mine, those blackened eyes boring into me. A cold, sharp pain pulsed through my chest, and I realized with growing terror that the whispers weren't just noise, they were words. They were coming from within me. "You've always known," the voice rasped, though its mouth didn't move. The words seemed to vibrate through my skull, growing louder, drowning out my own thoughts. "You've always been the one." The room around us twisted and warped as though the walls were alive, bending and writhing like something out of a nightmare. My vision blurred, but I could see faint images flashing around me, familiar places, faces, moments that felt both real and foreign. I was no longer in the room. I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home. The walls were faded and cracked, but the details were unmistakable. My father's old coat hung on the rack, my mother's favorite vase sat precariously on the edge of a side table. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock I hadn't heard in years. I moved forward, unsure if my feet were touching the ground. The air was heavy, the light dim, but I was drawn to the living room, where a faint, flickering glow danced across the walls. Inside, I saw myself. I was sitting on the couch, a child of no more than 10, clutching a small stuffed bear with one arm and covering my ears with the other. My younger self was sobbing, rocking back and forth. "Please stop," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Please stop." Then I heard it. The shouting. My parents' voices filled the room, their words sharp and venomous. They weren't in the room, but their argument echoed as if it were happening right there. My father accused, my mother retaliated. I could feel the weight of every insult, every accusation. I tried to approach the boy, myself, but an invisible barrier held me back. I reached out, desperate to stop his suffering, but my hand passed through him like smoke. "You remember now, don't you?" The creature's voice returned, louder and more piercing than before. The room twisted again, the scene fading into darkness. I stumbled, falling to my knees. When I looked up, I was back in the house on Ashwood Lane, the creature towering over me, its grin impossibly wide. "This is where it all began," it hissed. Suddenly, memories came rushing back, each one more vivid than the last. The fights, the fear, the nights spent hiding in my room. My father's absence, my mother's tears. And then, the accident. The memory struck me like a physical blow. I was older now, standing in the garage of my childhood home. My mother was crying, her face pale and gaunt. She was begging me to let go of the past, to forgive my father. But I couldn't. I was so consumed by anger and hurt that I lashed out, yelling words I didn't mean, slamming the door behind me as I left. It was the last time I saw her alive. She had been found the next morning, an empty bottle of pills, beside her bed. The weight of the memory crushed me. I fell to the ground, unable to breathe. The creature crouched before me, its eyes narrowing as if it could see straight into my soul. "She called for you," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But you didn't come. You chose to run. And now, you've been running ever since." "No," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "That's not true. I didn't know." "You knew," it interrupted, its tone mocking. "You've always known. That's why you came here. That's why the dreams brought you back." The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The house, the whispers, the scratches, they weren't from some malevolent spirit. They were from me. The house wasn't haunted. I was. Every moment of terror, every nightmare, every fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, they were all manifestations of my own guilt and regret. The creature wasn't an outside force, it was a part of me, a dark, twisted reflection of the pain I had buried for years. "You can't run anymore," it growled, its grin widening. "You have to face it. You have to face her." The room changed again, and I was in my mother's bedroom. She was lying on the bed, her face pale, her body still. The bottle was there, its contents spilled across the nightstand. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The creature appeared beside her, its form flickering like a dying flame. It gestured toward her with a clawed hand. "Go on," it said, its voice low and venomous. "Say what you've been too afraid to say." Tears streamed down my face as I approached her. My knees gave out, and I collapsed beside the bed, clutching her lifeless hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't mean to leave you alone." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, the air grew lighter, and the creature's presence began to fade. But before it disappeared entirely, it leaned in close, its grin never wavering. "This isn't over," it said. "You may have faced the truth, but the echoes will always remain." And then it was gone. The house was quiet again. The whispers had stopped, and the scratching was no more. But I knew the creature was right. The scars of the past didn't simply vanish. They lingered, faint but present, like shadows in the corners of my mind. As I stepped out of the house for the last time, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. I had faced the nightmare, but I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped it. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint ticking of a clock, steady and unrelenting. The Endless Echo, Chapter 5, The Final Resolution. The house stood silent behind me, its windows dark, its doors closed as if it had swallowed the chaos within and settled back into its hollow slumber. I gripped the railing of the porch steps, my breath visible in the chill of the night air. The quiet wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that pressed into your chest and whispered that something unseen was still watching. I had survived. At least, that's what I told myself. The creature was gone, and I had faced the truth. The memories I had buried so deeply were out in the open now. But the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. I glanced back at the house one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows, a flicker of shadow, a faint distortion in the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. My hand tightened on the railing. "You can't stay here," I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. The road stretched ahead of me, winding through the trees and disappearing into the darkness. I began to walk, my footsteps crunching against the gravel, the distant hoot of an owl, the only sound accompanying me. But something about the air felt off. The night was too still, the silence too deliberate, as if the world were holding its breath. I reached my car, parked at the edge of the woods, and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to calm down. The key slid into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The sound was almost jarring after the oppressive quiet. I put the car in gear and started down the road, the headlights cutting through the dark like a knife. As I drove, I replayed everything in my mind. The dreams, the whispers, the creature. My mother. Her voice still echoed faintly in my ears, not accusatory, but full of sadness. "I'm sorry," I murmured again, as if she could hear me from wherever she was. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side forming a tunnel of shadow. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as fatigue began to creep in. The events of the night weighed on me, and the tension in my body refused to ease. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:34 a.m. But then it flickered. I blinked, leaning closer. The numbers shifted, twisting into something unreadable, the light dimming and brightening erratically. "No, no, no," I muttered, smacking the side of the dashboard. The headlights began to dim. Panic surged through me as the car sputtered, the engine coughing like it was choking on air. The steering wheel grew heavy in my hands, and the car shuddered to a halt. "No." I slammed my hands against the wheel. "Not now." The engine fell silent, and the headlights flickered out completely. I was left in total darkness, the oppressive silence closing in around me like a physical force. For a moment, I sat frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint light. It was distant, just a tiny pinprick in the sea of black, but it was there. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It didn't flicker like a lantern or sway like a flashlight. It was steady, unyielding. And it was getting closer. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. The battery indicator showed 12%, the signal bar completely empty. I tried to call for help anyway, but the call wouldn't go through. The light was closer now, and I could make out its shape. It wasn't a single light, it was two. Two glowing orbs, cold and unfeeling, like the eyes of something not quite human. My chest tightened. I threw open the car door and stumbled out, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air was freezing, each breath burning in my lungs as I backed away from the approaching lights. "Stay away!" I shouted into the void, my voice shaking. The lights stopped. They hovered there, motionless, watching. Then, as if responding to my fear, the whispers began again. Low at first, just a faint hum in the back of my mind, but growing louder with every passing second. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet their intent was unmistakable. I turned and ran. The forest closed in around me, the branches clawing at my skin, the underbrush tangling around my feet. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stop. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. The lights were behind me now, weaving through the trees like specters, always just out of reach, but never far enough away. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I scrambled to get up, but my limbs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth itself. And then I saw it. The creature. It stood in front of me, its form flickering like a dying flame, its grin as wide and menacing as ever. "You can't escape," it said, its voice a symphony of malice. "You can never escape." I tried to move, to fight, but I couldn't. The whispers were deafening now, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me down into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the creature's face, its grin stretching impossibly wide. And then, silence. When I woke up, I was back in my car. The engine was running, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The dashboard clock read 2:34 a.m. I blinked, my heart racing. Had it all been a dream? But as I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw them. The lights. They were distant but unmistakable, watching, waiting. And I knew. This wasn't over. It would never be over.